Time is always the enemy here. We have a first hour directed to the changes, if you will, in the threat assessment, and as they've happened in the last few weeks. And we have before us, of course, familiar witnesses. Eric Lapointe from the Executive Director of the International Security Policy and Strategic Affairs Bureau at GAC. No, Warren Fair, yeah, GAC, Greg's right. And from the Department of National Defense, Major General Greg Smith and Major General Robert Ritchie. So I'm anticipating that you've either agreed among yourselves to...
It's just Major General Smith.
Just Major General Smith is doing the 5-minute opening statement, and then we'll go to questions after that. General Smith.
Just checking. Yes, here we go. Yeah. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, as stated, I'm Major General Greg Smith, Director General of International Security Policy at the Department of National Defense. And with me, I have Major General Bob Ritchie, Director of Staff at the Strategic Joint Staff, and Mr. Eric Lapointe of Global Affairs Canada. Je vous remercie pour cette opportunité de...
Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you about the international security situation and how national defense and the Canadian Armed Forces are responding.
With the fall of the Assad regime proved us once again how the security situation can evolve quickly and unexpectedly. National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces, alongside with our Global Affairs Canada and others, will continue to monitor what this means for Syria, Russia and Iran moving forward. La Russie intensifie présentement ses...
Russia is currently escalating its attacks on critical energy infrastructure that Ukrainian citizens depend on.
Drone warfare and ongoing introduction of new capabilities requires constant adaptation, which presents significant challenges to national defense and the Canadian Armed Forces. We also see Russia's persistent cyber and disinformation activities, which frequently target countries that provide support to Ukraine. These efforts are intended to interfere with democracy and erode public support for Ukraine. Nous observons une compétition.
We are seeing competition between the great powers in the Indo-Pacific that includes actions below the conflict threshold, increasing tensions, and the risk of error. China is an increasingly capable and assertive actor that seeks to reshape the international system to advance its interests and values.
Is escalating its assertive and coercive behavior in Taiwan and the East and South China Seas, like recently when the Chinese Coast Guard rammed, blocked, and used water cannons towards Philippine vessels. North Korea's threatening rhetoric, ballistic missile launches, nuclear weapons development, and deepening military cooperation with Russia is very concerning and in violation of United Nations Security Council resolutions. Looking to the north, strategic competition, climate change, and technological advancements are making the Arctic more strategically important than ever before. As receding ice from climate change is rendering the Arctic more accessible, we are seeing increased interest from non-Arctic states and more assertive postures from strategic competitors. For instance, both Russia and China, sometimes in collaboration, are demonstrating a more assertive posture and using a broad range of military capabilities and assets to collect intelligence. As we navigate the geopolitical landscape, Canada is committed to upholding the rule of law and promoting democratic principles in our multilateral security efforts. Working together is an integral part of peace and security efforts, which is why Canada continues to cooperate with Ukraine and the multinational coalition to meet Ukraine's most urgent needs. In addition to the NASM systems, the air defense systems, Minister Blair announced $64.8 million in new donations and contributions to the Ukraine Defense Contact Group's drone and information technology capability coalitions. In the Indo-Pacific, we are increasing Canadian Armed Forces presence in multilateral exercises and expanding training partnerships, senior leadership engagements, and new bilateral agreements. In recognition of the strategic importance of the Arctic, our defense policy, Our North Strong and Free, recognizes Arctic and northern approaches as critical to global deterrence. Our increased spending will boost military readiness and expand capabilities in direct support of these priorities. La Défense nationale et les forces armées canadiennes.
National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces are committed to adapting and working with our allies as the international security landscape evolves. More than ever, our actions today determine the consequences of tomorrow, and we must be ready. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Smith. First is Mr. Allison. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and to our guests, thank you for being here today. So in light, you did talk about China and being more aggressive towards Taiwan. So what do you sort of make of this latest aggression in the last week? Is this a little bit of posturing before there's a change in government in the U.S., or is this just more of the same?
Mr. Chair, I'll start with a response. Again, China, sometimes they call it a revisionist power. It is trying to change the world order, whereby perhaps big powers can do to smaller powers what they want, which is why the Canadian Armed Forces wants to be more present and why we have Operation Horizon that puts a lot more Canadian capability in that region to demonstrate that we're contributing to security, and then that's not the right way to make changes.
So do you feel, given there's going to be a change in government in the U.S. in the new year, do you feel that that's going to change the relationship at all, or is this going to be more of the same?
Mr. Chair, from my perspective anyways, we have an excellent relationship with the U.S. I, of course, wouldn't speak to the political changes, but from a officials to officials perspective, we have an excellent relationship. We held what's called the Permanent Joint Board of Defense recently. It's the 242nd time that board was held. Excellent relationship, obviously, because that's the way the U.S. system works. Many of those officials will change out post-20 January, but we, I could throw over to my Director of Staff colleague here, have excellent defense-to-defense relations. So I don't have concerns from that perspective.
Do you feel that, as we look at what's going on over there, do you feel that North Korea is working with China as it comes to Taiwan? Is there, obviously there's lots of challenges when we deal with those types of countries, but do you feel like they're actively aiding China? What would your thoughts be in that?
Thank you, if I may. It's an excellent question. I would say, though, North Korea and Chinese cooperation is not centered on the issue of Taiwan. I think their cooperation is more related to maybe a nuclear program, fuel transfers, or to support the DPRK economy. And I think North Korea really, at the moment, is actually maybe early days, but focusing a lot of its relationship and its attention on working more closely with Russia. And that's what we're seeing in terms of deployment of North Korean personnel into Russia to fight in the war in Ukraine. And in exchange for that is maybe a technology transfer from Russia, but also other supplies. So just to answer your question, I'm not seeing the China, North Korea, Taiwan nexus.
Okay, that's great. You did mention, you talked about Syria just a little bit, and the fact that a number of troops and individuals fled to Russia. So, how do you see that playing out in the next weeks and months in terms of as you look into your crystal ball?
I'm not sure my crystal ball is that that effective, sir. I do say that obviously we welcome the end of the Assad regime, a brutal, murderous regime that has been there in power for over 50 years. What we are wanting to ensure is obviously the destruction of chemical weapons and ensuring that there's an investigation and documenting evidence of the regime's crimes. It is obviously still early days. Things are still very fluid in Syria at the moment. And so our focus at the moment is encouraging a political and inclusive and political process under the UN framework to allow Syrians to have the dignity and ability to run their country as they wish. There are some, from a security perspective, maybe some silver linings here in terms of, reduced access for Russia to the Mediterranean as a result of that, and also reducing Iran's influence in the region following that. But again, it is still very early days. It will take time to stabilize, and there may be still some very big hiccups along the way.
Mr. Chair, if I might just add some military perspective as well. The HTS leader, al-Jilani, signaled a desire for normalized tone. So what we might see is working alongside other parties and other minority groups going forward. Israel has seized the opportunity to move into the Golan Heights in around observation posts to ensure that no Syrian threats enter Israel. And then additionally, what we've seen from Israel is targeting of the regime forces. So the Syrian Navy has been degraded, and 350 strikes have destroyed what we think is 70 to 80% of the former regime's capability. There specifically, we're talking about air and ground platforms, and we've also seen efforts from Israel and the West around securing the chemical and nerve stockpiles.
How much time do you have, John? Well, okay, so then maybe one final question, which I'm sure needs a lot more explanation. Maybe we have the people pick it up. But you talked about the North and the Arctic, and the concern and the climate change, the fact to be more accessible. I mean, there's just so much that needs to go into how do we defend the Arctic. So I mean, you know, this is less than a 60-second answer. What are some of the things that we need to start doing to be able to have a presence up there and start being able to defend the Arctic, so to speak? Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So first off, we do have a significant presence in the Arctic with our Rangers Alert in Ellesmere Island, 440 Squadron, and then Loyal Edmonton Regiment. But more importantly, we need to invest, as we have in the Northern Operational Support Hubs, which will provide responsiveness and agility to the North. Additionally, we're investing in expanding the capacity of the forward operating locations that allow us to surge more capability into the Arctic region to respond. In terms of domain awareness, Arctic over-the-horizon radar is in progress with our U.S. colleagues and integrated with NORAD headquarters out of Colorado Springs.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the answer there, Mr. I'm sure there will be, and I'm sure you'll get eventually an answer there. Mr. Collins, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our guests. I'll start with Russia, and Major General, you talked about defense relationships, and you said you weren't going to venture into the political arena, and I certainly understand and respect why that's the case. But defense relationships can't be changed by political decisions. And we're seeing that certainly with the whole question of U.S. support for Ukraine. And there's an open question right now in terms of whether this is just political bluster and or whether the new U.S. administration really means to bring an immediate and quick end to that conflict. That can happen in many ways. That can happen with a withdrawal of support, as has been hinted for the last year in the lead up to their election. And so I'm wondering, you know, if in fact the new U.S. administration holds firm on their public statements that that this is going to come to a quick end, that will mean a withdrawal of support in whole or in part, whether that's military intelligence or whether that's actual armaments that are making their way over to Ukraine. How long can Ukraine survive in their conflict without U.S. support? I'll start with that, and I'll have some supplementals.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, obviously the U.S. is a key contributor. We've seen over $60 billion in the most recent release of funding to them, so it's a key contributor. That being said, Canada has equally contributed a lot, over $4.5 billion in lethal aid, the training we're doing under Op Unifier. There's a lot of different ways that we're continuing to do that, and there'll be forward announcements as we do that. So the U.S. is critical, but Canada's also been an important part of the contribution to keep Ukraine going.
And if they pull their support, then Ukraine could decide to turn then to its other allies to say we need more. I'm certain that we would look to try to provide more assistance, but I think that call would certainly fall on the shoulders of Europe in terms of those who have as much or more to lose with an aggressive Russian advancement beyond Ukraine's borders. And so can I get an understanding in terms of where the conversation is between President Zelensky and his administration and European officials in terms of supplemental support in addition to what they've already provided?
Thank you for your question. I think there's an active conversation that is currently going on between President Zelensky and European allies. I heard in the media this morning France and Poland are discussing maybe a potential peacekeeping operation post-conflict. But all that to say, I think the original comment of your question is we actually don't really know where the U.S. administration is going to go on this. There's been a lot of talk. Part of it is probably election posturing. Part of it is trying to shape the ground. What we do know is that President-elect Trump has nominated former National Security Advisor to the Vice President, General Kellogg, to be his Ukraine advisor. And what General Kellogg has said in the past is that, in terms of the peace plan for him was freezing the battle lines, linking U.S. military aid to Kyiv's participation in peace talks, delaying Ukraine's NATO membership, so putting it on pause to allow Russia to come to the negotiating table, and then lifting sanctions on Russia only after an agreeable peace has been put forward agreed by Russia. So all that to say is it's a bit speculative, but I do your ultimate point is if the U.S. were to withdraw in part or in whole its support, I certainly see Ukraine will be looking to others to come forward, and certainly European allies, but Canada too, given what we've been at thus far.
Okay. Mr. Chair, if I might just add militarily, as late as 2 days ago, had an opportunity to meet with elements of the framework nations, so 14 nations, including those most importantly from Europe. And we see opportunity as we work on contingency planning together for the post-stabilization scenarios. Additionally, I would just say that both the conventional and special operation forces commanders have been in Europe examining what could be contingency scenarios to make sure that we're agile in response to post-inauguration events.
Our chair opened the meeting saying there's a lot going on, I think is one of the statements that he made. And I'm fascinated by the not new relationship, but the stronger relationship that's formed between North Korea and Russia, and certainly with their participation in the war. What does the future hold in that regard in terms of that seemed to be a silent partnership in the past, something we didn't read or hear about until they inserted their foot in the door of the war effort. And so if this war is coming to a conclusion, that relationship will still exist. And I'm wondering, no one has a crystal ball, but I'm wondering what your assessment is in terms of what that relationship looks like post-Ukraine war.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'll open with my characterization of the military interactions and then provide the opportunity to colleagues to answer your question. So we've seen 12,000 North Korean troops deployed into Russia. Importantly, also equipment. So 50 howitzers and 20 multiple launch rocket systems, which are pretty sophisticated capability. And they've gone, as this group knows, to the Kursk Oblast. Russia, in turn, has also used 60 ballistic missiles from the DPRK against Ukraine. And to what my colleague earlier said, we think that there's an exchange where Russia is providing to the DPRK fuel, money, and most importantly, technology that does have the propensity to destabilize the peninsula.
And Chair, the only...
I think we're going to have this pattern all for the entire meeting where we're starting to get into the meat of things, and I have to cut it off. Mr. Simard, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses. You were saying earlier that it is speculative, of course, but that the USA may stop sustaining or supporting Ukraine. That said, I imagine that you have developed potential scenarios should that become the case. You said in response, I think to Mr. Ritchie, that likely at that point Ukraine would turn to other allies to make up the difference. I wonder, based on the scenarios that you've developed, how Canada could in part make up the difference, the support that would be withdrawn from the USA. Thank you for your question, Mr. Chair. We are now speaking with allies regarding these potential scenarios. So far, we have a relationship with Great Britain for the training of new recruits, and we are ready to pursue that collaboration for Ukrainians. We are also examining what will be needed, the capability and the geography of the situation. So far, we haven't enough information, though, to be able to specify our plans. Thank you. Considering the support that Canada might offer, I imagine that it's less material support. I mean, I may be wrong, but from what I've heard and from what I've read, there are shells, 155 millimeter shells that should have been sent into Ukraine, but it's a complex logistical issue, and we aren't doing this as quickly as we might like. is this an indication of the fact that Canada's participation isn't so much based on material, but rather of a logistic nature? Perhaps medical or training, training the troops over there. Is that really what we're up to? If I may, I will give you an overview. We, as many other allies and partners of Ukraine, have in place a long-term security agreement with Ukraine. So it's a 10-year agreement which underpins our assistance, and there are many aspects of it. Financial, so that's budgetary, macroeconomic, military, development assistance, humanitarian assistance as well. So overall, as the Major General has underscored, we have provided 5-some million in military, but 19.5 billion overall has been provided by Canada to Ukraine in assistance. So should the American assistance drop to zero or be reduced, then we would be providing more assistance across all those categories for reconstruction, for military purposes, and so on and so forth. Perhaps I could just pass it on to Major General Smith. Mr. Chair, allow me to add that saying that it is only a logistic or training type assistance, not true. 4.5 billion, that's a lot of money, and a good deal of equipment, yes. Yes, we do a good job of training. We provide all of this through what we call the Ukrainian Defense Contact Group, 24 meetings. We've been there every time, and there'll be new meetings in the year to come. It's a system allowing all nations to come together, over 50 various states, to work together to support Ukraine, and we have good standing in that group. All right, how much time do I have? Thank you. I have read in an article quite recently that half of the new anti-tank missiles don't work as they should. And this is equipment that would have been sent to troops in Lithuania. So what happens when you have that sort of logistical bottleneck? You need a supplier capable, able to repair the equipment. Is that how you proceed? Thank you for your question, Mr. Chair. Let me say first that in 2023, National Defense procured these missiles. They were used by our allies. Quite a good deal, actually. So an update on this technical issue for you. The team immediately reached out to the manufacturer, Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, and we are working with them to solve this issue. What really counts is that despite slight delays, our ability and the long term will remain unchanged. January 2026 will remain our full capacity date.
I wanted to dig a little deeper into some of the questions that were asked before about Ukraine, Russia, and the relationship with the United States as that's potentially changing. There was lots of conversations about the withdrawal of support of the U.S., but there's also a great deal of concern, especially as Russia is now pushing so hard on the Kursk region, as you had mentioned. There's a great deal of concern that the United States will actually force a ceasefire or a new reality for Ukraine and new boundaries and new borders and so on. What are the plans on our end from either Global Affairs or D&D should that, and again, your crystal ball type of scenario, what would that look like for Canada?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Perhaps, again, I'll just start by providing an update militarily on what we think is happening in Kursk and then provide it to my colleagues. So as the committee knows, on the 28th of August, we saw Ukraine seize 1,300 square kilometers in the Kursk area. Since then, by November, Ukraine had lost 40% of that. We now think that it might be down to Ukraine holding about 800 square kilometers. The last thing that's relevant militarily is that Moscow has reportedly committed 60,000 soldiers to the Kursk area to try and re-seize the Kursk and reassert its border in advance of the U.S. presidential inauguration.
Thanks, Bob. If I can just jump in a few things. I mean, I think what's important to see, you're right, the U.S. may want to put pressure on for a peace deal, but I think it also takes two to get a peace. And, at the moment we haven't seen, direct credible movement on the part of Russia to also engage in that process. I mean, Putin's objectives for the war remain his objectives, and anything that the U.S. puts forward may not amount to that, and so that's still an issue. In the meantime, we've seen what Ukraine has done is basically put a strategic pause to its 10-point peace process because it wants to see what the U.S. administration has in mind. From a Canadian perspective, obviously, we've talked a little bit about it in terms of providing continued support to Ukraine and our allies. From an overall perspective, Canada, as well as our allies and partners, fully support Ukraine's bottom line in this, which is peace must be just and lasting at the end of the day. And so the decision to negotiate a peace settlement has to come from Ukraine when it is ready to do so. That's certainly the policy, and that's what we'll be doing to support that objectives, recognizing that the U.S. may put different kinds of pressure onto Ukraine. But again, also, Russia has to come to the table.
I'm going to shift a little bit. Many of my constituents have family in Lebanon, are from Lebanon themselves, and are closely monitoring that ceasefire, hoping that it lasts, of course. We know that Israel's bombardment of Lebanon had a horrific impact, obviously, in terms of their future or their attempts to even rebuild back from the Beirut explosion and so many other issues surrounding Lebanon's rebuild overall. Can you talk about what Canada is doing in terms of the work to support that ceasefire, but also the rebuild?
I can start. Thanks for that. Obviously, we welcome the ceasefire. I think it's a much-needed step towards stability and security in the region, and are closely monitoring its implementation. We also are, in terms of Canadian support, obviously any initiative that is addressing the impact of the crisis and long-term stability along the blue line is key. Canada is engaged in a number of discussions amongst G7 allies and partners on how to support the ceasefire, the holding of the ceasefire, and future prosperity, including discussions on reconstruction. But I don't have any of those details, but I know we're involved with G7 partners. But maybe I turn it off if anybody else has anything to add. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So I would just say that our assessment is that we're likely to see increased or sustained tit-for-tat engagements, but otherwise we think the underlying premise holds for the ceasefire, specifically that the Israeli Defense Forces, after over a year of intense conflict, are seeing the opportunity to rest, refit, and reconstitute, focusing Gaza, now an unstable eastern flank with Syria, and then in terms of Lebanese Hezbollah in Lebanon, obviously significantly degraded. To your question, Canada already is a staunch contributor to the UN through the UN interim force in Lebanon. Additionally, we contribute under Impact 10 people with the Canadian Training Advisory Team in Lebanon, which I can provide details on what they've been up to if you're interested. But equally important, we've been at the table at the military technical agreement alongside allies as recently as a week ago, and we have another engagement next Tuesday where a host of nations are discussing how to augment the capacity of the Lebanese armed forces in partnership with the UN to secure the area between the Israel-Lebanon border and up to the South Litani River in Lebanon.
go to our 5-minute round. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you for being here today to the witnesses. Early on, General Smith, you talked about working with our allies. Is that NATO, or does it move beyond NATO and include places like Israel?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So allies, absolutely. NATO, 31 others there as well. Indo-Pacific, Canada continues to make great strides under the Indo-Pacific strategy to build political relations and military connections. Israel remains a partner in the region. We do have a relationship with Israel militarily, although equally, as my colleague just said, under Op Impact, we're in Kuwait, we're in Lebanon, we're in Jordan, so we're very present. Sinai, I could go on. We are present in the region to produce stability, but Israel remains one partner.
Thank you. Speaking of Op Impact, how does the situation in Syria, as it's evolving, affect our involvement there?
Let me start, Mr. Chair, and then maybe others want to try to provide something else here. So we're monitoring the situation in Syria. Like, I think the world was surprised by what just happened. I think we all watched the news over the weekend and saw how quickly the regime fell. We are not in Syria. That being said, between forces we have in the surrounding area, we continue to track what's happening. And indeed, as was characterized, we have forces in the region. We are not making steps right now to put forces into Syria, nor are we being asked. Under Global Affairs Canada, we're watching what the situation is actually and to see how that progresses towards some type of stable long-term regime.
And Mr. Chair, I might just add that we continue to watch the threat situation very carefully and make prudent adjustments for the force protection of our individuals, including their posture, their location, their travel, and their security.
General Ritchie, you had mentioned the normalized tone from al-Jilani. Is this to be trusted?
Mr. Chair, maybe I'll start by saying it's early days, and we're just trying to assess the region, the dynamics, the credibility of the partners, to assess whether there's a say-do gap between what we hear and what we see, do so in partnership with other government departments and allies, and then try and find credible partners in the region with whom we can work militarily.
Is there any effect on our immediate effect on our reservist recruitment strategies or deployments on Op Impact as a result of the evolution in the Middle East?
Mr. Chair, not at this time. Our Operation Impact commitments remain firm, although, as to my earlier point, we have adjusted posture slightly within the missions for the security of the members, but we wait to see the developments in the region and how the Canadian Armed Forces might respond.
You had mentioned UNIFIL earlier. What's our commitment to UNIFIL?
Our commitment to UNIFIL is 2 individuals, and we also have 2 individuals that are under the United Nation Disarmament Observation Group, UNDOF. One was in Damascus that has moved to Camp Farwar, and the other one is in the Golan Heights right now between Israel and Syria at Observation Post 51.
Okay. So with the changes in Syria, how do we view the strength of their military after the bombardments that we've seen from Israel in the last days?
Mr. Chair, our initial assessment is it's largely evaporated. And as my colleague characterized, there's been heavy bombardment by Israel and other forces to dismantle extensive parts of the Syrian regime forces. But we continue to monitor the new regime, what they've done, which so far has seemed to be quite moderate. Very early days. This happened over the last weekend.
And Mr. Chair, if I just might add 2 broader implications. One is the Syrian development is going to challenge LH in terms of Iran pushing supplies, equipment, technology into Lebanese Hezbollah in the Lebanon area. And the other is we're watching Russia carefully. They had a base in Latakia. They had maritime vessels in Tartus. The maritime vessels have moved to sea. But we're watching their posture to see how they may adapt long term.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was my next question about the Russian naval assets. So we understand then that Iran's influence has been weakened by the developments in Syria.
Mr. Chair, maybe I'll start and then let my colleagues jump in. So we've seen Iranian influence weakened on a few fronts. The first is in Gaza with Hamas. The second is to the north of Israel in Lebanon with Lebanese Hezbollah. And then the third now is Syria to their west. all of which are rolling back what could be layered support that upon which the Iranian defense construct rests.
Mr. Belowski, 5 minutes, please.
The big question with respect to Ukraine and Russia is what Trump's going to do, obviously. You talked about General Kellogg and his previous stance, which seemed to be to freeze the front lines as they presently are and hold off allowing Ukraine to join NATO. I wouldn't have thought that this would be acceptable to Ukraine. Pawlowski is actually a Ukrainian name. I would just say that what the Ukrainians would expect would happen in that scenario would be that Russia would just build up its forces again in a few years, take another bite of Ukraine. So there'd have to be, I think, for this to be acceptable to Ukraine, to be some sort of other peacekeeping. Has Canada contemplated, or has NATO contemplated, I guess it could not be NATO, but is Canada contemplating the possibility of bringing peacekeepers or using peacekeepers along the border between Ukraine and Russia? Because I would have thought that would be the only kind of scenario that would make this acceptable, because that would deter a further attack from Russia.
Mr. Chair, I mean, I've done peacekeeping. You need a political agreement between both sides before tactical people can get in the middle and create peace, and we are a party to the conflict. We have been contributing extensive weapons. That being said, we, like the rest of NATO, are watching what's going on there and monitoring, and trust me, NATO is making lots of plans because they also share that risk that give 5 years, what Russia has proven to date could happen again, maybe not against Ukraine, but other allies, including some where there's thousands of Canadians right now. So we're paying attention to that, and it's good to be in alliance with 31 other countries.
I don't know if you'd tell me whether it was true or not, but is the Canadian Army drawing up contingency plans to possibly use Canadian troops as peacekeepers?
Mr. Chair, again, peacekeeping is a very specific thing. Did it in the 90s. There's a monument downtown Ottawa for a very specific situation. We have been contributing weapons to Ukraine since the further invasion occurred in February 2022. And normally, as a peacekeeper, you are neutral, I say in air quotes. So tactically, that would be very challenging. And as has been noted, number one, would some of the things being suggested be satisfactory towards Russia? Equally, would that be satisfactory towards Ukraine? There'd have to be a lot more water under the bridge before we decided that was even a possibility.
Your assessment of how the North Korean troops are doing in the Kursk region, it seems like the Ukrainians have hit them a number of times. There's, what, 12,000? How many do you figure are still left?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Mr. Chair. So we don't have precise numbers. What we are attuned to is once the 12,000 were set, they were the subject of intense observation and targeting from Ukraine to try and sever that linkage between the DPRK and Russia. We continue to monitor the situation. What we have seen is that the DPRK has broken down their contributions, and we're seeing them employed now in smaller groups within larger Russian units, and incidentally, alongside many Russian soldiers that are coming from the Far East that are forming aggregate organizations that make it more challenging to try and identify where the DPRK troops actually are serving.
Briefly on the new Syrian leadership, what's your assessment of their current links to al-Qaeda? And certainly the new leader has shown some indication for wanting to take a more moderate approach. I think Canada would surely like to see a democratic, moderate state in Syria. What are we doing to encourage that? Because certainly it could go either way.
Okay, I'm going to give that a try, and maybe my global affairs colleague would like to. Again, this happened over the weekend. Nobody was really expecting this. We are watching it, and like I said, the initial signs are very promising. You didn't see massacres as they started taking retaliation against regime forces. We're seeing heart-rending things about the prisons, etc. That's all ongoing right now. Initial signs are very positive. That being said, is there any tradition of democracy in that country? I'm not a historian in that sense, but initial signs, it's looking good, but I'll throw over to my friend here.
Thanks. If I could just add a few points. I mean, throughout the conflict, while our embassy has been closed in Damascus since the beginning of the conflict, we've still kept Canadian diplomats have had contacts and exchanges with members of civil society in Syria. And obviously, those have been engaging with those contacts throughout the weekend in the past few days, and will continue to be able to sort of liaise and understand what the situation on the ground is from their perspective, and sort of use that to build our information, to understand how things are going, and to work with allies and partners, again, in terms of how eventually we can support this transition to what we hope is a better future for Syrians.
Mr. Samar, 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Major General Smith, in your statement, in your opening statement, you spoke to us about disinformation coming from Russia. I would like to know what sort of form that takes. It's easy to understand that their aim is to undermine confidence in institutions and perhaps as well to send a different image, if you wish, of what the conflict in Ukraine is all about and how it's going. But does it have any real effect in Canada, for example? Do we see any public opinion aligning behind any of this Russian disinformation? And what would that look like? Mr. Chair, I will speak for the Canadian Armed Forces and the National Defence. Yes, disinformation takes aim at the Canadian Armed Forces. Let me give you an example of an officer in Europe who died recently in Europe, natural causes, and disinformation came out to the effect that this person was killed in Ukraine by Russians, an untruth. This is a small example of how they take information, twist it in order to try to influence the Canadian Armed Forces. Do they succeed? I'm wondering whether, specifically with regard to the Ukrainian conflict, I sometimes go looking through social media, which can be, pretty heavy-handed, some of the stuff there. I wonder whether this influences the public in general, who might start to disagree with Canada supporting Ukraine. Mr. Chair, I don't have any data in this regard, but I will again speak for the National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces. We have a chain of command which ensures that correct information makes its way to all the troops and that we counter these lies. But it's something that we certainly need to attend to in all communications with our service members to counter these false narratives. This National Defence, I'm sorry, I see I'm out of time.
5 minutes, please.
So there's a great deal of tensions obviously rising in terms of nuclear threats. The United States has committed $1.7 trillion to modernizing its nuclear arsenal. Russia's introducing the revised nuclear weapons doctrine, launching new nuclear-capable ballistic missiles into Ukraine. So we're sandwiched in the middle, basically, of these two massive nuclear superpowers. We've talked a little bit about our own Arctic sovereignty. However, in this context, in March, there's going to be the third meeting on the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Will Canada be sending delegates to this meeting, and is GAC currently considering joining the TPNW as a signatory?
Thank you, Chair, for the question. At the moment, I'm not aware. It's not within my purview, but I'm not aware of Canada considering sending anybody to the TPNW meeting in March at the moment.
Other NATO allies like Germany or Belgium, they're participating in that conference. What's the reasoning behind our lack of participation?
Again, this is not within my purview, but I'm not aware of anybody planning to attend at the moment.
Wouldn't it be prudent, considering the rises that we're seeing, I think the clock is set at 90 seconds in terms of that potential full destruction for us to take a role in the way that a medium power, soft power could do in terms of that move towards nuclear disarmament?
I'm not aware of thinking Canadian participation at the TPNW meeting at this moment.
One of the concerns I have in terms of our procurement is that while we don't have a nuclear power, we certainly are building potential newer equipments or are procuring newer equipments that have potential nuclear capacity, like the F-35s. Could you comment on Canada's view on that?
2 seconds to answer it, and I think it's probably not wise to try. So I'm going to go to Mr. Bazan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses and thank General Smith and General Ritchie for your service to Canada, and Mr. Laporte for always bringing your expertise. You mentioned that there is probably a technology transfer happening between Russia and North Korea. What technology transfer do we think that is beyond enriched uranium?
Mr. Chair, I'll start. Maybe some of my colleagues want to help. I don't know anything about enriched uranium transfers from Russia to the DPRK. North Korea, have had a nuclear program for decades, so they've had some. But we're looking at like maybe delivery systems, missiles, and other capabilities like that. Russia is ahead of the DPRK, and they may be transferring those type of technologies.
What about submarines?
Mr. Chair, what I am tracking is missiles, perhaps air defense interceptors, fuel, money. I am personally not aware of submarines.
Okay.
There may be some discussion around fighter aircraft, but we have nothing conclusive.
Okay. Now, North Korea already committed 12,000 troops plus munitions and rocket launch systems to Russia for the war in Ukraine. There's rumors that those numbers of 12,000 may be increased. Any intel to suggest that it is going up beyond the 12,000 troops?
Mr. Chair, I have no conclusive information on that. We continue to actively watch that in partnership with allies. It's difficult to see when North Korean troops may enter the east side of Ukraine. It's much easier as they're moving towards the front to discern how they're getting equipped with clothing, weapons, equipment, and then moving and integrating. But at this point, only 12,000.
Okay. We talked about Operation Impact in the region. We know that the Ring of Fire around Israel has been virtually destroyed now, especially with the fall of Hezbollah, Hamas, and Syria under the Assad regime. How is that going to change the posture of Iran in Iraq using Quds Force, the IRGC, and the Sunni or the Shia militia units that they have that they're backing in Iraq, and how does that potentially impact Canadian troops that are serving alongside our allies?
Mr. Chair, first of all, I wouldn't characterize a fall of either Hezbollah or Hamas. They've both been severely damaged by Israel, as indeed Israel has damaged. It's not my facts, but has been disclosed as heavily damaged the air defense system of Iran itself. Iraq remains having Iranian-aligned militia groups, and indeed we have Canadians under NMI, NATO Mission Iraq, inside in Baghdad. We're paying very close attention to their force protection, but more importantly, there is going to be a transfer of responsibilities from Operation Inherent Resolve, the U.S. mission, to NMI. We could see that being delayed potentially, but for now, that is they're all very carefully watching the force protection situation.
So when we're looking at the Iran relationship with Russia and their ability to use Syed kamikaze drones and other rockets and munitions supplied by Iran, with the degradations that happened because of the war in Gaza and Lebanon, and do we see their ability to supply Russia going forward depleted as well?
Mr. Chair, thanks for the question. So Moscow is indeed providing fighter aircraft, air defense, as well as space technology And then Tehran is providing Russia with support for the war in Ukraine. Is our understanding of that relationship?
Okay, and just in my last minute here, Mr. Chair, I just want to move the motion that I tabled last week, that the committee hold 3 meetings in relation to the defense components of the Arctic foreign policy announced on December 6, 2024, within 14 days of the adoption of this motion, and invite the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of National Defense, and the Minister of Northern Affairs to appear separately for no less than 2 hours each with the departmental officials.
I thank the member, and I'm sorry again for our witnesses who are here, and thank you for your services. If possible, I would like to bring an amendment to the motion, and I hope that we can have this understanding quickly. And I know it's just being passed, so I'm going to make sure that... So I would like to remove within 14 days of the adoption of the motion, strike that part, and invite the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of National Defense, and the Minister of Northern Affairs to appear separately for 1 hour. Yeah, no less than 1 hour, please. Thank you, and sorry for our interpretation, with their department officials.
That's fine.
You still want Northern Affairs here? Okay. Okay, any other conversation? We first of all deal with the amendment separately?
Yeah, it still says 1 hour each, right?
1 hour separate.
Yeah, okay.
1 hour separate, okay. Those in favor of the amendment? Those opposed? So the amendment carries. Now the main motion as amended. Those in favor? Those opposed? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your cooperation. We will endeavor to get that going as quickly as possible. Ms. Lapointe, final 5 minutes.
Thank you.
I know that my colleague, MP Bazan, was asking about the Baltic regions, but I too would like to ask a question on that as well. Major General Smith, what is your assessment of Russia's military posture and hybrid warfare activities, particularly in relation to NATO's eastern flank? I recently went just last month and visited countries in the Baltic region as well as Poland. And how should Canada be responding to these evolving threats?
Mr. Chair, I'll start and say, so Canada's obviously got a major footprint in Latvia particularly. We have excellent relationships with Latvia and the other 12 countries that are participating in that multinational battle group, and indeed just did an exercise entitled Resolute Warrior, which I think was a huge success. The Secretary General himself was there. A number of colleagues were tremendously impressed. So I think that's an example of how well things are going from Canada contributing to deterrence under NATO. That being said, to respond to the question a little bit more fulsomely, Russia has been extensively damaged. The Russian armed forces have been extensively damaged due to their operations in Ukraine. They've equally shown a tremendous ability with their own defense industry to reconstitute. So Canada, as part of NATO, is paying a lot of attention to that and indeed responding to the plans that NATO has put together to make sure that we are both able to deter and defend in that region.
Iran's use of proxy networks has been destabilizing in regions like the Middle East. How does this tactic directly or indirectly affect Canadian security interests in our global military commitments?
Mr. Chair, let me start, and as I characterized earlier, I think Iran's proxies have been extensively damaged. Israel has dismantled extensive parts of Hamas and Hezbollah itself, and indeed damaged Iran. So I think that is an area we're looking at. Indeed, I think what just happened in Syria over the weekend is an excellent characterization of the reduced capacity of both Russia and Iran to influence their abroad, if you will. So I think we're going to continue monitoring that, both from a Russian and Iranian perspective, to see what more they're going to do, because they have shown a great ability to reconstitute.
Thank you. Major General Ritchie, what role does Canada play in monitoring and countering North Korea's missile and nuclear development, particularly within NORAD and through cooperation with Indo-Pacific allies?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Mr. Chair. So I'd start out by saying that we are an active participant in monitoring the United Nations security resolutions to include any ship-to-ship transfers of fuel or technology. Over a cumulative commitment, we've had 12 maritime patrol aircraft that have undertaken missions, as well as 11 warships. Most recently, it happened with maritime patrol aircraft in October, and then a warship just last month. We continue to monitor, and we are from time to time having interactions with PRC, Chinese aircraft or vessels. Those are generally speaking safe and professional. Sometimes they are either unsafe and or unprofessional. And then we are becoming more sophisticated in our ability to capture those things and then come out quickly with the truth and communicate exactly how something transpired, as opposed to to the colleagues' questions where sometimes it's portrayed a certain way, but that might not actually match reality.
If I can just add a few comments on monitoring DPRK nuclear and missile activity, in addition to everything that Major General Ritchie talked about in terms of the D&D CAF component, sort of air and maritime monitoring. Global Affairs Canada also has some extensive engagement on the diplomatic front, financial, to reinforce sanctions. For example, in October, Canada, along with a number of like-minded countries, joined what's called the Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team, MSMT, which is basically a stand-up mechanism that has been established by partners following the fact that Russia vetoed the continuation of a panel of experts on sanctions in the UN. So we've gone outside the UN and created our own sort of monitoring mechanism.
And Mr. Laporte, what is Canada's diplomatic strategy to address North Korea's provocations, and how does Canada leverage its partnerships in East Asia to promote stability?
Well, as part of our Indo-Pacific strategy, we have bolstered our diplomatic presence in the region. We work closely with D&D CAF personnel in terms of building capacity for security, and it's all about leveraging partnerships, including with South Korea, for example, Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam as sort of key countries. India was part of our Indo-Pacific strategy. At the moment, the relationship is difficult, but India is a key player in the region, and we will want to get back to there when the circumstances allow. But it's also working with like-minded on things like I just mentioned, the multilateral monitoring mechanism for sanctions.
Before I let you go, October 7, 2023 was largely regarded as an intelligence failure on the part of Israel. Every commentator, including yourselves, say that we were caught by surprise, was unanticipated, that this event happens in Syria. Does that give you concern that our intelligence is not as good as it should be?
Mr. Chair, I'd start by saying, as you know, under the new defense policy, we have made geographic strategic choices. We're going to protect Canada. We're going to protect Canada's Arctic. We're going to participate in the Indo-Pacific, and we're going to participate in Europe. Now, that doesn't say we're not going to look at the Middle East, but that's not where we have the majority of our forces, nor is that our focus. So Canada's a big country. We're not a world power, but we focus across the world, and there's always going to be gaps. And if Canada was surprised, clearly Israel was, clearly the United States were, so we're not the only ones.
And Mr. Chair, if I just might add, we're also seeing increasingly sophisticated technology, and in this instance, it was discovered that there were extensive subterranean access routes, which Israel has subsequently poured concrete into to deny these subterranean access into Israel. But we now have to be much more aware of pan-domain threats and how capabilities are aggregated in pan-domain space that certainly complicate how any military acts.
If I can just add one.
I would love to engage this conversation because I frankly disagree with you, General Smith. Not the first time, probably won't be the last. But yes, Canada's a big country. We are members of the Five Eyes, and our intelligence, and this does appear to be, at the very minimum, a collective failure of Western intelligence to anticipate this development, which has implications for Canada. They may be 1, 2, 3 steps removed, but it does have implications for our own security. So unfortunately, I'm out of my own time. But thank you for this conversation. I thought it was particularly rich, and we particularly appreciate you coming. With that, we'll suspend and then re-empanel. Director, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at the Stewart Center. And we also have Robert Hamilton, head of the Eurasia Research Foreign Policy Research Institute, both joining us by video conference. Welcome, gentlemen. If you would, we'll have Mr. Bergman open with a 5-minute statement, and then we'll go to Mr. Hamilton. Thank you for making yourselves available. So with that, Mr. Bergman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a real honor and privilege to be speaking to the Parliamentary Committee today on what is, I think, an incredibly important topic. I was going to focus my introductory remarks on the threat posed by Russia in the period ahead, because I think we need to be very clear-eyed that no matter how events in Ukraine play out, that as long as Vladimir Putin remains president of Russia, he will be a determined adversary of Canada and of the United States and of Europe. Vladimir Putin, I think, is very much driven by seeing the United States in particular as Russia's main adversary, as the main obstacle to Russia's geopolitical greatness. And he is consumed by Russia achieving a grand geopolitical stature. While we looked at events in Syria with great awe over the last month as sort of a defeat of Russia's efforts in the region, I think we have to go back roughly 10 years to when Russia intervened in Syria. I was then at the U.S. Department of State, and we were all shocked that here was Russia intervening in a country inside of a civil war in a region where it is not in. It was in the Middle East. Russia had previously, for the past 25 years, focused on its near abroad, and here Russia was in the Middle East. And it made Russia a significant player in the region, had helped it build its ties with Gulf states, with Israel. And the purpose of this intervention, I think, largely was about Russia's ability to act on the global stage, and represented, I think, Russia for the first time since the end of the Cold War, kind of returning to its great power stature that it had during the Soviet period. And while this past month has been a grand defeat for Russia's grand strategy, it is not going to sort of lay down lightly and will continue. And I think what we have to remember, just looking at Russia's military, is that Russia's army has been significantly ground down by the war in Ukraine. It is suffering tremendous casualties, more than 500,000. Its ground materiel have been significantly depleted. Yet Russia has built up a tremendous defense industrial base, has invested significantly with the help of China and with others, and with its vast smuggling networks. And so Russia's production capacity is going to be sustained whether this war ends in 2025 or not. And that will mean, I think, a relatively fast effort to recapitalize its ground forces. But then when we turn to the other aspects of the Russian military, the Russian Navy, the Russian Air Force, Russian space capabilities have been far less impacted by this war. And what we have also seen is Russia really significantly strengthen its military relationships with not just North Korea and Iran, but also China. And this has meant, and maybe as a final comment, that China is playing an increasing role in the Arctic. I think this is not something that should cause short-term concern. In many respects, this is driven by China simply looking at the fact that the climate is changing, and that this is potentially a new significant global trading route, and so therefore it's only natural for China to scope it out militarily. However, I do think that this portends down the road, over the long term, a growing Chinese presence in the Arctic. While this may make some Russians uncomfortable, that, I think, has been sort of the price of Chinese support for Russia. And maybe as a final comment, I also think that Russia's past history as being, in fact, a rather important actor when it comes to nuclear nonproliferation has been completely reversed by this war. Russia had been a key part of the Iranian nuclear negotiations, sanctions toward North Korea. But Russia has reversed that because of the short-term focus on the events in Ukraine, and I don't see it returning. So Russia's willingness to provide missile components, other technology to actors like Iran, to actors like North Korea, and perhaps others around the world, I think it should be of significant concern to Canada, to the United States, and into many in Europe. And maybe I'll close it there.
Mr. Bergman, nicely within 5 minutes, too. Appreciate it. Mr. Hamilton, 5 minutes, please. You're on mute, Mr. Hamilton. It's the curse of the 21st century.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to appear. As Mr. Bergman said, it's an honor and a pleasure to be before the committee. So I'll start by saying Russia poses the only existential threat to the United States and its NATO allies, including Canada, due to its nuclear arsenal. But that's a threat that's highly unlikely to materialize under current conditions. I would argue that a more likely and still profoundly dangerous threat is a combined Chinese-Russian military confrontation with the West. Also not necessarily likely under current conditions, but something that's much more conceivable than a Russian strategic nuclear attack on the U.S. and its NATO allies. Russia is an acute militarized threat to the entire Euro-Atlantic area. It's an acute militarized threat to the U.S., Canada, and all of our NATO allies. China is the only state, as the U.S. national security strategy says, with both the will and the capability to rewrite the rules of international order. So to be blunt, it's a vital national interest of the U.S., I think Canada and all of its NATO allies, not to have to fight a war against China and Russia at the same time. The question then becomes how to avoid this outcome. The most serious, currently active threat to North American security, I would argue, is the war in Ukraine. If Russia wins in Ukraine, I'll sort of paraphrase the words of one of what I consider to be our best Russian military analyst, Dara Masakot of the RAND Corporation, who says if Russia wins in Ukraine, it will be bruised, vengeful, and overconfident, believing it has bested the West. Because to be clear, Russia is fighting in Ukraine, but it's fighting against, it believes it's fighting against NATO and the Europe and North America. Every time Putin has believed he has bested the West, in 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Ukraine, 2015 in Syria, he has launched a larger and more ambitious war in the wake of that war. And so I think it is a important, if not vital, national interest of NATO states that Russia not win in Ukraine. And also, what happens in Ukraine is going to affect China, and it's going to affect the Indo-Pacific region, because both China and our partners and allies in that region are watching the outcome of the war in Ukraine to learn things about Western tolerance for risk, Western support of Ukraine, Western support of partners and allies in other regions. On the other hand, I think lumping China and Russia together as a singular threat, as you'll sometimes see Western policymakers do, I think that is not in our interest for a couple of reasons. One, it obscures the major difference between them. Yes, China is trying to rewrite or remake the rules of international order. Russia, I would argue, is trying to burn the international order down using military power, where China, to this point, is primarily using diplomatic and economic tools. The other thing about lumping them together as a singular threat is it drives them together. The United States has been called the binding agent in that relationship. And it's not, I think it's not for nothing that if we look where China and Russia are most in partnership, it's areas where the U.S. and in some cases its other partners and allies have the largest footprint, especially military footprint. So I think the best way to avoid the outcome of a combined Chinese military challenge or confrontation to the West is to think hard about policies and actions and drive them together. And that means think hard about where we deploy military power. Places like Europe and the Indo-Pacific are non-negotiable because we have binding treaty commitments to allies and partners there. But it's no coincidence that where our footprint is the lightest, places like Africa and Central Asia, cooperation between China and Russia is also the lightest. And in some places like Central Asia, competition is emerging. So I would, I'm at 4 minutes now. I'll sum up by saying another threat we need to look at that's not sort of in the military domain, but is more in the informational domain, is we need to strengthen our democratic and societal resilience throughout the West. Russian election interference is something that's been going on for a long time. Very recent examples we can talk in the Q&A in Moldova and Romania. Disinformation, we need to strengthen critical thinking skills. and consider ways to prevent Russia's use of our open societies against us. Finally, on China and information, China long used the information instrument to build a positive image of China, but it's now more using Russian methods, which is to discredit the idea of objective truth altogether and to discredit our own governments in the eyes of our people. And I'll stop there.
I hope our colleagues are as disciplined as the two of you are in terms of time management. Ms. Gallant, first up, 6 minutes.
Okay, so to Mr. Hamilton, how does the fall of the Bashar regime shift the paradigms in the Russia, China, Ukraine, European realms?
So, as I said in a recent interview with Forbes Ukraine, Russia's defeat anywhere is good for the world. And so what has happened recently in Syria, I believe, is a defeat for Russia. How it shifts, I don't think it has much, and I'd be interested to hear what Mr. Bergman thinks. I don't think it has a significant impact on Russia's war effort in Ukraine for a few reasons. One, Russian assets in Syria were fairly light. The number of ground forces was very small. It was never more than several thousand. I think it's much less at this time, mostly advisors and special forces. The air and naval assets that Russia had at Hmeimim Air Base in Latakia province and in Tartus, it only had a handful of ships. Those have now been moved somewhere around 8 to 12 kilometers offshore in the Eastern Mediterranean, awaiting developments. I don't think if Russia were to reprogram assets from Syria into Ukraine, it would have a significant difference. In terms of Russia's relationship with China, I also don't think it has a direct effect. It is a defeat. It is I would argue, not necessarily a strategic defeat for Russia, but it's a defeat of a regime that Russia had propped up for 9 years and wanted to see win. So I would argue that actually the war in Ukraine and Russia's demonstrated military incapacity, at least in some areas, has had a more direct effect on China's perception of Russia than what has happened in Syria.
The huge buildup over and around Taiwan this week by China. Would you say that, or would you reassess the 5-year projected ability for China to invade Taiwan to have changed, or are we underestimating that timeline? Or was this just another one of Xi's hissy fits over the new president going over to the U.S.?
It's a great question. I will preface this by saying I do not consider myself a China expert. I wrote a book on China-Russia relations and have done research over the past couple of years on that. But I do consider myself more of a Russia specialist. So the 2027 timeline we keep hearing about that Xi Jinping has given the People's Liberation Army is the date by which he wants the PLA to have the military capability to liberate Taiwan, to invade and occupy Taiwan by force. I don't necessarily think that means that the clock is ticking in 2027, it runs out. I do think it runs out that Xi Jinping sees himself in the same way Putin does as a historical figure, as an epochal figure, and therefore, by the end of Xi Jinping's tenure, I think his goal, and I think for him it's non-negotiable, is to have Taiwan reintegrated. How that happens diplomatically, economically, or militarily, I can't say.
Okay, so you were in Montreal, and you witnessed the full court press of Ukrainian representatives pleading for an invitation to join NATO, recognizing that that would not be immediate. There are many standards that have to be met, but that was the best way to stand up to Putin. If that were to happen, and I know that there isn't consensus yet, how would, or what would the impact be in Ukraine? Would that change Putin's aggression, or would it stop the increased aggressions, the escalation?
Yeah, my sense is that however the Ukraine war ends, and I think that unfortunately it's likely to end with Russian troops still occupying some portion of Ukrainian territory. But however it ends, the only way to prevent, and I listened into the first session, and this was also a theme, my sense is the only way to prevent Russia from restarting that war as soon as it's rebuilt its military capability to what it considers the required level is for Ukraine to have legally enforceable security guarantees whether it's NATO membership or some consortium of countries, probably almost all NATO members, who give Ukraine legal binding security guarantees and say, if you are invaded again by the Russians, we will fight. Then the question becomes, how do you deter that invasion? Is a legal document, whether it's NATO's Article 5 or some other legal document, adequate, or do there have to be forces on the ground? Does there have to be a deterrent force from non-Ukrainian militaries present in Ukraine? I think the latter is far more likely to deter renewed aggression than just binding security guarantees. But it also comes at much higher risk because, and then immediately, as we already have in 8 of frontline NATO states now where there are battle groups present, and immediately a Russian invasion of any of those countries or Ukraine, if there are forces on the ground, would put Western military forces in a state of war with the Russian Federation.
Okay, so do you have any information on these reports that we're hearing of drones being dispatched from the Atlantic, over the Atlantic Ocean to New Jersey? Any clarity on that? What's going on there?
Not from me. My knowledge of that is CNN deep. I keep hearing it's an Iranian mothership, and the U.S. Department of Defense has said no, there's not. But again, I'm not an expert witness on that topic.
Ms. Lambropoulos, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here to answer some of our questions today. I'm going to start with Mr. Hamilton. You spoke about the best way to avoid a China-Russia confrontation against the West. You said that would be like the biggest threat that we should be worried about, and that while it's not super likely in the near future, there are things that we can do in order to limit the possibilities. So can you be a little bit more specific? You said, we can watch where we're putting our resources, our army. Can you be a little bit more specific and give us some more ideas of how we can ensure that this type of relationship or this type of collaboration doesn't happen in the future?
Sure. And I'll say that so the narrative about the China-Russia relationship is whether it is a strategic partnership or an axis of convenience. And those are sort of nice academic sort of ideal types that help frame the debate. I think neither of them is accurate. I think the relationship is dynamic, complex, and contingent. It's dynamic because it responds to things that happen in the world. What happened in Syria recently is one of those. It's complex because they interact across what we call the instruments of power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And it's contingent because these are great powers that have presence all over the world, and it can be affected by things that happen on the ground that might be out of the control of neither of the capitals in Beijing and Moscow. So, as I said, our commitments to our NATO allies and the countries with which we, in this case, I mean the U.S., have binding security commitments to in the Indo-Pacific are non-negotiable. They're legal commitments. And therefore, there's a requirement to deploy military force there to deter conflict or to prevail in conflict if deterrence fails. Other parts of the world, Africa and Central Asia, I mentioned as examples. I looked at China for this book project. I looked at Chinese-Russian interaction in Africa and Central Asia, places where the U.S. military footprint is lighter than in Europe and the Indo-Pacific are places where Chinese-Russian interaction tends to be either compartmentalized, as I would call it, in Africa, where each is doing its own thing, is vaguely aware of what the other is doing, but they're not cooperating or coordinating, or in Central Asia, increasingly they're competitors, especially in the economic sphere. So my sort of admonition to Western policymakers, and this applies to U.S. policymakers especially because I hear this from them a lot, is we should try to drive a wedge between China and Russia. My advice is do not try to do that. Think about where we deploy military power, be judicious in where we deploy military power, ensure that we only deploy military power where vital or core national interests are at stake. And then and in places like Central Asia, I think our strategy is fairly correct. We talk about things like sovereignty, democratic resilience or civil society development, regional cooperation, economic development. Those are things where Western partners can make a contribution in Central Asia. It doesn't trigger fears of Russia and China of some sort of Western military presence or intervention, and it probably does allow conditions for Chinese-Russian competition to emerge, whereas otherwise it wouldn't, especially if we were there in some sort of military sense.
Okay. Thank you very much for that answer. You also spoke about strengthening the resilience in the West against misinformation, disinformation, against perhaps Russia and China's attempts to destabilize the West. And so I'm going to ask you about some examples you can give that have already occurred in Canada, for example, or in the West, where they have been successful at doing this, and things that we should be looking out for to take precaution, of these situations in the future.
Yeah, so I very briefly, because I was coming to the end of my time, I very briefly mentioned Moldova and Romania as the two most recent examples of sort of, this is Russian election interference, but it's also combined with information operations, propaganda, disinformation. In Moldova, the Russians tried indirectly through a Moldovan oligarch who's resident in Russia to buy 300,000 votes against Maia Sandu's candidacy for president and against the referendum on EU accession or integration. In a country like Moldova, 300,000 votes is enough to swing an election, and they came very close. They were able to buy over 100,000 before the Moldovan security services understood what was happening and were able to shut this effort down. But that's one example. Another example in Romania, where Gheorghescu, this candidate who won the first round of the presidential election and literally came from nowhere, he was in 8th or 9th place among the candidates a month prior to the election. He had no organization. He had no funding. He had a TikTok presence that was was definitely amplified, according to the Romanian special services, intelligence services, was created and amplified by the Russians, out of the Russian Federation. What's interesting is it appears that TikTok was initially unaware and then tried to take measures to prevent this, but were unable to. So, of course, the question becomes, in the Romanian case, was this some sort of combined Chinese-Russian effort using TikTok to promote the candidacy of an anti-Europe, anti-NATO, pro-Russian candidate for the Romanian presidency? It doesn't appear it was. It does definitely appear there were Russian fingerprints all over this, but it does not appear that even TikTok, much less the Chinese government, was a part of this effort. So the Romanian Constitutional Court has now annulled the first round of the elections. It will be rerun. But again, these are two cases where Russia came very close to swinging the outcome of a democratic election using misinformation and interference.
We're going to have to leave it there, Ms. Lamropoulos.
Thank you.
Monsieur Samar, 6 minutes. Mr. Samar will ask his questions en français.
Mr. Samar, you have...
As long as you're into the interpretation channel. Monsieur Samar.
Mr. Samar, 6 minutes. Thank you very much. We have the interpreter. Yes, you can hear me? Thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. Both of you have addressed the support or collaboration of China with Russia. I would like to hear you in greater detail about the form that takes.
Maybe I can start. Well, I think right now the form that is taking that is most significant is that China is effectively blunting the impact of global sanctions against Russia. So sanctions have proven quite effective at making an economy, tanking an economy, causing economic pain and immiseration. And China is making that, is blunting that effort. For instance, the Russian car industry has effectively collapsed, but Russians now can buy very good Chinese cars instead. And that extends to the military and defense industrial production, as I mentioned. And then what is China getting in return? Well, China is getting, I think, a number of access to Russian military technology that's more advanced than what they have. Things like aircraft engines, perhaps missile defense, fighter designs, other, I think, technology related to kind of advanced systems. And then, as I mentioned, China is also seemingly getting more access in the Arctic and in other places. And maybe just a quick point is that I think we have oftentimes thought that we could wedge these two countries, Russia and China, because of the conflict that emerged during the Cold War, because of Nixon to China. But that had also stemmed from, after the death of Stalin, competition within the communist world over leadership and a 10-year rivalry between China and Russia. And what we've seen now is a more than 10-year effort by both Putin and Xi to build ties. And because both leaders really buy into this relationship, I think it's quite durable. And that's extending deep down into the bureaucracies militarily and economically.
And I would just add, of course, the question of China's support for Russia, I think, is most important in terms of the war in Ukraine. And I think what you're seeing is sort of diplomatically, China is mostly supporting Russia in that it is not. It's been described as free riding on Russian vetoes of UN Security Council resolutions on Ukraine, because the Chinese know the Russians are going to veto anything that calls for a Russian withdrawal from Ukraine or criticizes Russia's invasion of Ukraine, so they abstain. So it's sort of passive diplomatic support. Informationally, China's information operations are very closely echoing Russia's justification for the war in terms of NATO enlargement, indivisibility of security, and all these things. Militarily and economically, I would describe China's response as self-interested more than direct support of Russia. So we know that Russia has asked for direct military support. We believe that China has not provided it. I mean, that's the conclusion of all the Western intelligence services. China is exercising more with the Russian military, ground, sea, and air. And they're doing that because Russia is the only country on the planet right now fighting a Western-trained and equipped adversary, and the Chinese are trying to learn from that because they think they may have to do something similar in the future. So it does provide sort of a little bit of legitimacy to the Russian military exercising with China, but China is also benefiting and learning from that. Economically, yes, China is providing dual-use items and items that allow the Russian economy to sustain itself in the face of sanctions. Frankly, so are many other countries on the planet, to include a lot of EU and North American countries. They're just doing it through intermediaries like Kyrgyzstan, until recently, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia. If you look at exports from the EU, for instance, several EU countries to Kyrgyzstan, they've gone up 2,000 to 4,000% over the last year. Well, we all know where that's going, right? It's going through Kyrgyzstan into Russia. So China is just doing the same thing, but directly. And then I would end by saying I think the Chinese-Russian economic relationship, is more and more approaching a colonial relationship where Russia exports raw materials to China, oil and gas, at a discount. So the Chinese are buying Russian oil and gas, yes, but at a deep discount. And then Russia's importing finished goods from China. So more and more, Russia's in a subordinate position economically.
Merci.
Thank you. So, that being known, should the United States decide to cut their support to Ukraine, what message would that send? Could it increase the pressure that China is putting on Taiwan? Could it, in one way or another, shift the strategic relationships between China and Russia?
In less than 30 seconds.
So should the United States stop providing military aid to Ukraine? And let's be clear, the Biden administration is going to spend down all its military aid budget by the end of its term, which means that in order for there to be additional aid, President Trump will have to request that military aid, and that may be unlikely. My sense is that Russia will then move to try to win the war and will not be very interested in negotiations. I don't really see China stepping up to increase its support. but I think what it will to Russia, but what I think it will do is cement the perception within Beijing that the West is not in anything for the long haul, and ergo, even if it were to get into trouble by trying to invade and occupy Taiwan, and if that were to be a slog like Russia has experienced in Ukraine, after many years, China would eventually prevail because the West would lose stomach for this fight, which sort of confirms old sort of communist sentiment about the weak kind of capitalist materialist West. So I think it would affirm that perception.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I apologize. Ms. Masson, 6 minutes.
I suppose I could pick it up from there, actually. My first question was going to be fairly similar in that now with Trump 2.0 coming onto the scene, we may see major differences, the consequences of how that may threaten that stability of world order, but certainly with the new Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, could you maybe just continue on what you were saying before you were cut off in terms of those differences? But the one thing that I had also asked in the previous panel wasn't necessarily, yes, there's a potential of withdrawal from the West or by the West, by the United States in this conflict, but what about the pure, more significant interference of determining how that peace will go down, or peace, and to the expense of the Ukrainians in terms of territory or what have you, and what that would look like?
Maybe I'll just start quickly. Just to extend what I was saying, look, I think when we look at negotiations between Russia and Ukraine with the United States pushing for them, the question we have to ask is what's in it for Vladimir Putin? Why would he agree to negotiations when he thinks right now that he's winning the war, that U.S. support may not be there over the long haul? And he just experienced what happens to the Ukrainian military if U.S. aid is suspended when we stopped providing aid between October 1st, 2023 and April when we finally passed the supplemental. And what happened was the Ukrainian military withered greatly, and Russia experienced great gains in which Ukraine is still trying to recover from militarily. So I think you'll look at the end of 2025 as a real opportunity where Ukraine will be significantly withered militarily. And yes, Russia has lost more than 500,000 people. But we know this here in the United States. The sunk cost fallacy really applies when you're in a long war where you may have lost a lot and you think, you want to get out, but on the other hand, you can see a light at the end of the tunnel, and I think that light at the end of the tunnel for Putin will have gotten brighter with the United States being less willing to support Ukraine over the long haul.
I agree completely, and I would just add that for trying to incentivize Ukraine into a negotiation now, I think is especially with the prospect of cutting off military assistance to Ukraine would be a grave error. And as Mr. Bergman said, first of all, the question is, what's Russia's incentive to negotiate? Now, there are many different flavors of a possible Trump strategy for Ukraine that have been floated. There was one by Mike Pompeo and David Urban last summer, neither of whom are going to be in the administration, so I'm not sure it has much purchase. But it was what I think a little more realistic strategy in that in an early phase, we would actually step up military support to Ukraine, lift some of the restrictions to increase the pain level on the Russians and incentivize them to come to the table in good faith. The problem, I think, with that and all the Trump versions, the versions of Trump strategies for Ukraine, is I think they're a little bit unrealistic or even naive on the post-conflict security architecture. Because they really, they talk about delaying Ukraine's NATO membership 10 years or just leave that question unanswered. If you leave that question unanswered, you're only delaying the start of the war again. The war will start again as soon as Russia has rebuilt its capability. It hasn't given up on its objectives to control all of Ukraine, or at least control enough of Ukraine to make whatever's left an unstable state with almost zero economic potential, military potential, and a massive social and political dislocation and problems. So I think increasingly the question, the most important question of the current stage of the Russia-Ukraine war is, can Ukraine survive militarily long enough for the strains of the war economically and politically to really start to have an effect in Russia. And I believe there is a time coming. Russia's been a lot more resilient than we expected economically, but many of the indicators point in a direction, only in one direction, and that is of a Russian economic degradation over the midterm and a possible economic collapse. But again, these are things that are hard to predict, and I'll say I'm not an economist, but all the indicators, recent indicators about the Russian economy are very negative. And the Russian central bank is having increasing problems sustaining the economy and maintaining the level of economic activity and GDP growth and things like that. So I think forcing Ukraine into a negotiation especially without incentivizing Russia to come to the table in good faith, and I also think leaving the post-war security architecture sort of undefined would be really significant errors.
You briefly spoke about Armenia and that part of this greater conflict too. Could you talk about or give us an update on the state of that, how that Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict plays into this larger picture as well?
Again, 30 seconds for an absolutely new topic. Go ahead.
Not entirely new.
What I would just say is that for Armenia, what has been clear is Russia's not a reliable security partner. Armenia had banked its security on sort of a Russian security guarantee, which then was not there. And Azerbaijan has taken advantage. And I think Armenia's in a very tough place presently, trying to pivot towards the West, building ties with France and the United States. Yet Turkey and Azerbaijan are squeezing Armenia. And I think there's real danger, especially with events in Georgia playing out, that could that our Armenian democracy may be in trouble, and so I think they're in need of assistance because they made a bad bet previously. But I think there's real room for Canada, for the United States, and for Europe to play an important role here.
That's an,
Yeah,
sorry, I apologize, but
okay.
I've got we're into our second round. I've got 25 minutes worth of questions to be squeezed into about 18 minutes. So we're going to be down to 4 minutes a pop. Well, we didn't. We started right on time. No, we didn't. We started right on time. So we'll go ahead. I'm happy to go 5 minutes.
Start the timer and then we'll go.
Start the timer.
So, yeah.
So you want us to do 5 minute rounds? Yeah. Okay. If you're going to do 5 minutes rounds, then we're good. You're good. What's that?
4 minutes over.
We can go 4 minutes. Okay. 5 minutes, get going. And but I'm going to be really ruthless, Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question I have was related to Syria and Russia potentially losing some military sites with the fall of that regime. I wonder if you can comment first, Mr. Hamilton, on that, and then Mr. Bergman.
Sure. So Russia's two main military sites in Syria were the air base at Tamimim in Latakia province and the naval base at Tartus. Those are both very important for sort of status and prestige reasons for the Russian Federation in its own self-image as sort of a global power. And they're also important in terms of power projection in the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, as far south as the Sahel in Africa. They are Russia's main power projection platforms in that part of the world. So to this point, it does not look like they're in imminent danger of losing them. I've seen assessments of an evacuation underway. I don't see anything. Yes, there are transport aircraft coming in and out. Yes, they've moved the ships from Tartus offshore a little bit, but I don't see the amount of activity that would indicate a major evacuation underway. I think the Russians, they're very good at back-channel negotiations. I'm sure they've been talking to HTS and the other opposition groups the entire time. There was a Syrian sort of caretaker prime minister from the Assad regime that stayed on. And so I think Russia believes it can preserve its access to those bases. We'll see, but I think that's the calculus in the Kremlin now.
Yes, I agree with that assessment. The one thing I'd say is I think the West has a lot of leverage here, particularly if we are going to provide, potential aid to the new Syrian government, if we're going to delist it as being a terrorist group. And the Russian influence here is simply that they have some military assets on the ground. The one other thing I would say is that this is a loss of prestige for Russia, but the maintenance of these military bases is both key for their destabilizing presence in Africa, but also for having diplomatic presence with Gulf states, with the Israelis. And the Israelis did not provide significant aid to Ukraine in the start of this war, in part because of Russia's presence. And the Gulf states have not been necessarily all that helpful when it comes to clamping down on Russia sanctions and other efforts. And they may be more accommodating should Russia be fully evicted from the region.
Chances that Russia just redeploys those naval assets back into, to strengthen its forces against Ukraine?
I don't think it can because it's a belligerent, and I think they're in the Mediterranean now. They would have to come through the Bosphorus, which means the Montreux Convention is operative. And my understanding is the Turks have been fairly scrupulous in not allowing countries that are belligerents in the war in Ukraine to enter the Bosphorus. But again, I caveat by saying I'm also not a Turkey expert.
No, that's my understanding as well.
What does if we go back to the Ukraine situation with Russia, what does that say with the U.S. commitment? If Trump does go ahead and does not provide more aid, what does that say about their commitment to the rest of Europe?
Well, I think it speaks to where the United States has been moving, and I think that where the United States has been moving is really a focus on the Indo-Pacific, and I think Donald Trump in particular has not viewed NATO as particularly important to the United States, and I think that's been a long-held position over many decades. During his first term, he ordered his Secretary of Defense to pull troops out of Germany, and so I think there's a prevailing sense that the United States wants a paradigm shift when it comes to European security, where we are less interested in providing European security than we have for the past 75 years and want to shift that responsibility to Europe. The problem is that European security is entirely dependent on the U.S. military, and removing that is like removing the backbone, and that's very hard to replace. And so I think an abrupt pullout, which I'm afraid might happen, will leave Europe very, very insecure.
In your introduction, you talked about a lack of critical thinking in this country. Can you explain to me what you mean by that and how we can address it?
I think you mean me, and I didn't mean Canada specifically, of course. I meant in Western societies in general. And I just meant that, look, Russia is extremely good. This is not your grandfather's Cold War ham-fisted Soviet propaganda that we're seeing in Western societies. This is there's a very good RAND Corporation report from 2016 called "The Fire Hose of Falsehood," and it talks about Russian misinformation, and it talks about sort of four characteristics. It's high volume, it's multi-channel, it has no commitment to consistency and no commitment to objective truth. And so the idea is that Russia is not trying to get Western publics to build a positive image of Russia or to agree with the Russian position or to think that Russia's telling the truth. It's trying to undermine the idea of objective truth altogether and have Western publics believe that all governments lie all the time, and therefore what my government says is no more legitimate than what comes out of the Kremlin. And so it takes critical thinking skills to sort of disentangle what's objective truth that does still exist from what is not truth.
Okay.
And unfortunately,
we're going to have to leave this again. I stop and apologize. I just can't do this. We were on to the second. Madame Lalonde, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you. I would like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on Russia's reaction about the Assad regimes and its fall. But do you anticipate a repositioning of Russia? And I know my colleagues mentioning Ukraine, which I'm more interested as to see, could we see possibilities where Russia could repurpose some of their assets into the Arctic or Africa, and even maybe finding other ways within the Middle East that they could continue to have certain power, if I could say in quote?
Yes, I think what Russia will attempt, and it still remains to be seen if they're fully evicted, and I think their first step will be to try to maintain their current presence in Syria. But if they are evicted, I think we will see them try to shop around to see if they can strike a deal, perhaps with in Libya, in Tobruk, possibly Sudan. What is key is that Russia needs to have a naval port where it can support its forces in Africa and its private military contractors. And this is critical for Russia's sort of broader authoritarian support services, essentially, which it provides for many African leaders, and which is really, I think it sees as a vital geopolitical tool to potentially create instability, migration flows, other things that then could gives it some leverage vis-a-vis Europe and works to destabilize European politics.
I would just add that Sudan is I think, the most likely place. Russia and Sudan, after years of stops and starts, have finally concluded a basing agreement for a Russian naval base at Port Sudan on the Red Sea. I don't know how long it takes until that base is operative, but that would be, to me, the most obvious place for Russia to relocate if it had to out of Syria.
Thank you. You mentioned, and I really appreciated that Ukraine needs to win, and Ukraine is fighting for Canada and all NATO allies. And we heard this numerous times by a number of other countries. We did discuss the possibility of a U.S. military retraction, which in my view also would be deterrent, like a very bad decision in the leadership leading to President-elect Trump. How does a win for you is? Like, what's the win? And I believe that losing territory is not a win, but I would really like to hear your opinion on how does the win looks like.
So for me, I think it goes back 10 years. And what is this all about? And I think this is about Ukraine realizing its European future, and ultimately membership in the European Union and Ukraine being a free and liberal democratic state, part of Europe. And I think that can happen with territorial concessions. So whether Ukraine has the Donbass or Crimea, at least from my perspective as an American, is not the relevant thing. It is maintaining sovereignty, maintaining its democratic status and its European future. And I think negotiations can get there with territorial concessions. It will not be easy pill to swallow, but I think that the focus needs to be preserving Ukrainian democracy and then Ukrainian freedom to kind of choose its own future.
Yeah, I fully agree, with the caveat that no Ukrainian politician can say that out loud going into negotiations, obviously. But yes, negotiations will probably lead, there'll be some negotiating space, and it'll probably lead to some outcome, I think, where Russian troops remain on part of Ukraine's territory. I think a good analogy here is the Wells Declaration throughout the Cold War in the United States that never recognized the incorporation of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia into the Soviet Union. And that may seem sort of as a weak or diplomatic response to a military occupation, but it had legal consequences when the Soviet Union collapsed, in that it was a resumption of diplomatic relations with those three countries and not the establishment as it was with all the other Soviet republics except Russia. So some sort of analog to that in terms of Russian occupation of Ukraine, I think, is what would be advisable.
So I'm going to ask you, because it was mentioned in a public forum that I have the pleasure of participating, where the current territory that's occupied by Russia also contain a lot of critical mineral. And when I think about critical mineral and the world future, I do believe that that asset should stay within Ukraine, which is democratically elected country, as you mentioned. So leaving that territory to possibility to Russia, how can that be seen as a win for NATO's or United States of America?
Well, I think that would be, that's a very negative outcome. And I think the broader question for Ukraine is whether fighting on and continuing to fight to try to retake that territory and the potential costs that could entail is worth is worth it. And I think there is a potential case for negotiations, especially given the state of the Ukrainian military, the state of the Ukrainian economy. So I think Russia could tee that up as a win. But I think the one other thing I would say is this is where maintaining sanctions vis-a-vis Russia, maintaining our posture toward Russia as a threat is critical. So I don't necessarily wouldn't consider that a victory for Russia if it occupies that territory. It's not a good outcome for Ukraine. But we may be in a situation where not great outcomes are where Ukraine is looking at, particularly if the United States is getting weak-kneed in its support for Ukraine.
Yeah, nothing to add. I agree.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah. 2.5 minutes, Mr. Simard.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. A little earlier, Mr. Hamilton, in response to a question put by one of my colleagues regarding disinformation, you said that the attempt was to do away with the very idea of objective reality. I wonder what forms that takes and what is being attacked in that effort. Are they trying to reduce confidence in institutions? Are they trying to get involved in the political debate here? Are they trying to influence specific groups of civil society? To your knowledge, what does this look like?
So I'll start with the last. Yes, the Russians are reaching out to both the far right and the far left in most Western societies. I think their ideological preferences for the far right, but they're very instrumental in how they do this, and they also reach out to far left groups. The idea is to destabilize societies, not necessarily to have most people in the society agree with sort of Russia's ideological view of how the world works. The Cold War analog to this, the Soviet Union did the same thing. Yes, most of its contacts were with the far left in Western societies, but it also reached out to far right groups, and it funded far right groups. And so because the idea, again, is destabilization, and the idea of causing people in the West to give up on the idea of objective truth is the objective there is to cause paralysis. Because if you give up on the idea of objective truth, you don't know who's right, who's wrong, then you're paralyzed and you can't react to what the Russians are doing. So I think that's the objective.
Est-ce qu'à votre connaissance,
to your knowledge, are there any such operations that succeed? Are we able to document the level of influence that Russians manage to have using these new communication methods? Do we have any data showing whether it works, or whether this phenomena has only minimal effects?
Yeah, and I don't think there's a lot of good data, because the thing is, this is hard. It's hard to determine exactly how many votes may have been swayed. But I would again point to the two recent examples in Moldova and Romania, where we know Russian money or Russian-linked money essentially bought over 100,000 Moldovan votes in their recent election, and Russian money, Russian influence operations caused the rise of a far-right candidate from literally nothing, from polling within the margin, insignificant, statistically insignificant, to over 22% in winning the first round of the Romanian presidential election.
Madame Matheson, 2.5 minutes.
I actually wanted to give Mr. Hamilton a chance. He never had the opportunity to answer in response to the Armenian-Azerbaijan question, so I'd love to give him the opportunity to answer on that. Thank you.
Sure. The South Caucasus is one of my favorite parts of the world. I lived in Georgia, served in the U.S. Embassy there for almost 4 years. Armenia picked the worst possible time for its turn to the West, unfortunately. And of course, they didn't pick the geopolitical conditions that surrounded their turn to the West. But if you look at Armenia's position, it's got 4 neighbors. Turkey, it has no diplomatic relations with. Azerbaijan just defeated it in war. Iran is its best bilateral relationship. Iran is a global pariah state in many ways. And then there's Georgia, which was always Armenia's window to the West. Georgia has now possibly another a case of Russian influence operations having been successful. The Georgian government is increasingly anti-Western and authoritarian. There have been hundreds of thousands of people on the streets in Tbilisi for over 2 weeks now, sustained since the Georgian government announced it was suspending its EU accession process and rejecting EU aid after it manipulated the October parliamentary elections to award itself a victory. So Armenia is in a really difficult position. And as Mr. Bergman said, it's reaching out for partners. Russia's clearly not reliable. I tell Armenians when I'm there that don't assume the West is a reliable security guarantor either, because we're not. We just don't have high enough order interests at stake to come to Armenia's aid if it's attacked again. And so it needs to diversify its partnerships. It needs to matter in a diplomatic and economic sense, have strong economic and diplomatic relationships with countries around the world. Armenia-India is another relationship that has really, really burgeoned in the last several years, including in the defense sphere. I think Armenia is now India's #1 export destination for arms. So it's a tough situation. The entire South Caucasus, Armenia in particular, it's just a really bad time for a turn to the West.
Mr. Bazan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank our witnesses for attending our meeting today and helping us get informed. I want to talk a little bit about the new administration's posture. When we talk about Ukraine, and I think a lot of people also think that Trump's going to be equally tough on Putin to get to a peaceful resolution in Ukraine. But there's another calculus here is Trump has also talked very tough about BRICS and their desire to replace the U.S. dollar as the global currency. So, and he's been quite aggressive in his rhetoric towards those countries about destroying their economies. So will that make him even more aggressive when dealing with Vladimir Putin on the issue of Ukraine and as it relates to the monetary policies as well?
No, it's a very, very good question, and I read with interest Trump's statements vis-a-vis the BRICS. I do not necessarily think that he will link the two that closely. I think he'll probably bifurcate, deal with Russia individually. And my concern when it comes to Russia-Ukraine is that there could be an effort to kind of negotiate over the Ukrainians' heads with Moscow, and also over the heads of Canada and our European allies as well. And I see the effort by the administration to end the war, not necessarily to end the war on the best terms for Ukraine. When it comes to the BRICS and the international monetary system, it's a very good question about the dollar as the kind of the central reserve currency. I think in many respects, there's been conflicting information here. On the one hand, we see Russia and China actively working to create kind of an alternative system, and Russia's economic resilience thus far, I think, points to that an ability to perhaps be somewhat diversified away from the dollar. On the other hand, when there's an economic crisis, everyone wants to flock to the dollar, and the dollar remains incredibly strong. So it still is the kind of central reserve currency that gives the United States great leverage. People want to be part of the U.S. financial system. And so I don't really see Brazil and India going in siding with China and Russia, perhaps in that direction. But it is something that I think many experts in the global financial system are really watching out for to see how that progresses over the next few years.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Trump administration will sort of divide or bifurcate its responses to BRICS and de-dollarization in Ukraine. BRICS is about economic issues, which I think will lead in a Trump administration. They will lead with the economic instrument. Ukraine, I think we shouldn't forget, Trump got impeached over Ukraine. Ukraine's personal for him. So I think, will set that in a separate bin.
I appreciate that. I just thought that with his tough rhetoric, that he might carry that through on Ukraine as well. And I was hoping that the meetings that he's had with Zelensky would strengthen Ukraine's hand in the potential negotiations on bringing about the end to the war. Just want to talk about Syria again, the fall of the Assad regime. We talk about the Tarsk port that the Russian Navy has been using. In Turkey's interest in Syria and collapsing the regime, will you think that they would be opposed to Russia continuing any operations in Syria?
Well, I think Turkey would most likely want the Russian bases to be removed because they were on opposite sides of the conflict. That said, Turkey and Russia had, I guess, there's in some ways sort of quote-unquote frenemies where they have established really strong and solid working relationships at the same time while they clash in many ways over kind of their historic geographic situation. So I would see Turkey. I think Turkey could be a useful country in pushing for the expulsion of Russian bases, but we'll see what the Erdogan-Putin, if there is correspondence there, we may not know, but I think that may be one of Putin's first calls in response to the collapse of Assad.
I am very surprised that we haven't seen, the Russian fleet, sail through the Mediterranean up to the Baltics and go back to St. Petersburg, and that we haven't seen all the aircraft that are stationed in Syria, that Russia hasn't taken them home. So I guess the long-term impact of Russia's brutal mercenary operations, originally by Wagner in Africa, will be greatly undermined as well, will it not?
That would be a question there.
Yeah, that would be my presumption.
Okay. Mr. Pawlowski.
You've both talked about collaboration between Russia and China. Well, we've also started to talk about BRICS, and I wonder how we should be dealing with BRICS. How much is BRICS, because obviously Russia and China are a big part of BRICS. How much do you think that BRICS in itself is contributing to undermining the international legal order, given the central place of Russia and China in that organization? What should be our response to BRICS? And certainly the BRICS, I think, is trying to cater to a lot of lower and middle income countries to become part of BRICS, to be part of this global alliance against the West. And certainly I think they've been trying to win favor, for example, in Africa. Are we doing enough to kind of try to counter that and win favor and get some more allegiances from countries, particularly in Africa?
My short answer would be no. I don't think we are doing enough. And I think part of what the formation and expansion of BRICS highlights is that there has not been enough effort to, I think, really engage the quote-unquote global South or other countries as part of kind of the global international architecture, as we would call it. So we saw the Biden administration really double down on the G7. G7 is an incredibly important format, but not really create something that was inclusive of many of our democratic partners or countries that we want to engage more with in the developing world or global South, whatever name you want to use. And that's in particular Brazil, India, South Africa, but as well as other countries like Senegal. And I think that is sort of a blind spot, and that's where China and Russia have sort of seized the initiative to try to rebalance the global international architecture and expand BRICS. And so it's a diverse group, but I think it's something that we need to be very mindful of going forward, because it's an alternative way of setting norms, setting rules of the road for the international system.
Agreed, and I would only add two short things. First of all, the more BRICS expands, it now, as of this year, it includes Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE, the harder it will be to gain consensus. And then the second thing is, among China and Russia, the two largest countries in BRICS, I think there's a fundamental difference of what the purpose of the organization is. Russia is trying to turn it explicitly into an anti-Western organization. China and many of the other founding members, I think, are not on board with that vision. And so there's some daylight between their positions there.
Thank you, Mr. Pawlowski. We still have a couple of minutes left, and so I'll finish off. Our most famous political hockey-playing philosopher is a guy named Wayne Gretzky, and he's famous for saying you go to where the puck is going rather than where the puck is. And so I'd be interested in both your thoughts on where the puck is going with respect to the Kurdish involvement in Syria, particularly if there's going to be a drawdown of American resources there. Secondly, what Erdogan might be expected to do, particularly with the administration. Thirdly, the administration in Syria. Thirdly, you've spoken about the Russians extensively, so I think you've answered that. But fourthly, I think the big unknown here is Israel, as to what Israel it could be anticipated to do. So on 3 out of those 4, where is the puck going in the short term? In 25 words or less.
On Turkey, Turkey's biggest concern, I think, is the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the U.S.-backed organization, political military organization that controls essentially a third of Syria. Everything north and east of the Euphrates is under the control of the SDF, de facto. Turkey has already been attacking SDF units since the HTS takeover, since the sort of the unfreezing of the military situation there. So I think it remains to be seen. I think the U.S. is there with the SDF legally to destroy and then prevent the reemergence of ISIS. There's going to have to be some serious, I guess, behind-the-scenes discussions between the U.S. and Turkey about what the future of eastern Syria is, because right now it's not under the control of anybody in Damascus. It's under local control of the SDF. In terms of Israel, they've already mounted sort of a limited incursion into Syria. I was in Israel in 2018, and we were standing on the Golan Heights, and the Israeli army officer with us said, look, we are more comfortable with, at the time, a Sunni opposition group was in control of, this was in Dara province, that part of Syria. He said, we're more comfortable with them than the Assad regime across our border, because where the Assad regime comes, the Iranians come with. So I think Israel is probably happy about the fall of the Assad regime and the collapse of Iranian influence in Syria, but is watching very closely to see what happens across the border. I think I'll leave it there, because the other two I don't have a lot of expertise in.
I mean, I think I'll just state quickly on Israel that Israel has tremendous military tools, and what in some ways has now put the Middle East in a place where it needs more political tools, where the situation in Lebanon, for instance, where you would hope to see the Lebanese armed forces be able to assert more control and vis-a-vis Hezbollah and an actual state-building process occur there. Similarly in Syria. And then that brings to Iran, which where does Iran go from here? And right now they're very much down. And so I think there is real concern that Iran may see its weakness as necessitating a move toward a nuclear weapon, or this necessitates a potential opening for renewed talks with a Trump administration. I don't know if there'll be that appetite on the Trump administration's part. I think there is probably an opening where the Iranians are weak and would be willing to talk. And we'll see where Israel goes from there, because Israel will have a lot of influence, I think, over the course of direction of the Middle East and of U.S. policy as well toward Iran and the region.
Well, thank you both for your very thoughtful responses. This has been a rich discussion, and I know colleagues appreciate it. And thank you for making yourselves available. With that, meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.